And I
I
think went.
Yeah.
Yep, it went. Okay. So the idea of what I'm hoping to do is to get your feelings as a news anchor, one, reporting this on 9/11, and then two, some of the experiences that you shared with me a little bit last night after 9/11 and in your time in New York. And I don't know if you want me to ask you questions that, do this as an interview process, or if you just want to.
We're just kind of talk about how it impacted my life and kind of what I saw firsthand, more or less.
Pretty much.
Okay. Well, I can share some stuff, and then if you want to follow up with questions, feel free to do that too. Does that sound good to you?
Wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. Um, it's pretty wild to me that there are so many young adults who have no knowledge firsthand of 9/11 because it was such an integral part in my life. As a journalist, I was reporting in Spokane, Washington at the time, and I had just spent the previous summer, the last year at University of Arizona, interning for 48 hours in Manhattan. And I remember taking a whole roll of film atop the World Trade Center towers and looking down at the cars that looked like little ants with people along there. And it was just fascinating to me. It's like the center of the metropolis, you know. And I remember that morning getting a phone call from my sister. I was working night side at the time, so I would stay up late and stuff. And so she called me. I got the phone call and she said, "Do you know what's going on? Turn on the TV." To me, 9/11 is the first time in modern history that reporting the news, television journalism has really made a live impact in people's lives. Because I think back to other instances of war and Vietnam and stuff, you're sending photojournalists overseas and they're taking pictures and they're being sent back and then published at a later date. But with televised live broadcasts from Manhattan when the Twin Towers were hit, and then checking in on the Pentagon and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. All these things were happening real time. I would argue for the first time on a massive scale on television. And so now we're in a day and age where all your students are digital natives. They grew up with the internet. They grew up with cell phones. So you have social media and everybody's tweeting and sharing videos and posts. And now we have artificial intelligence, which makes it harder to vet things that are happening in real time. But 9/11 was truly the moment when I think everybody, once they heard about it, immediately flipped on the TV and were glued to this because it was just so unbelievable to see something like that domestically. There'd always been this threat, I think. I come from a military family as far as like my aunts or my uncles and my grandpas, and everybody had some sort of military service down the line. It was just like a family tradition. You don't see a lot of that anymore these days because we don't have a lot of open enlistment military families in these modern generations now. Uh, but when I saw that, I think it also really struck home to so many people that for the first time, these threats of war that we had seen and heard about and studied in school and everything became something that was on American soil. And that was something that was really shocking. I immediately ran into my station at the time, and they sent me out. All of us, it was like all hands on deck. Anytime there's breaking news, all the reporters, photographers, everybody kind of rushes to the newsroom and figures out how we can cover this in the best way possible. And again, I was in Spokane, Washington at the time, and my photographer and myself got sent to a general store down in the main area of Spokane, and we were getting video of people who were buying up American flags. All of a sudden, it was like the first time you see people rushing out, putting up American flags on the day of, which was hard to believe, but it was like people in the moment were watching television, shocked to the core by what they saw, but then also immediately sparked into like patriotic activism. They wanted to show on their sleeve, like, I can't believe this happened to my uh to my home, to my hometown, and how can we show like a community support and coming together. So we went out to this general store, and I'm interviewing people, and there was an older couple. The man was wearing a veteran's hat, and he had a walker. He had, he was wearing oxygen, like a nasal cannula, and I was talking with him and his wife, and it was, I'll never forget when I was talking to him about what happened that morning. He just grabbed my arm and he said, "We can't let this happen again. We can't let this happen again." And he just started crying and talking about when he was in war and how he watched his friend be blown out of a helicopter. And then in front of my eyes, he passed out. And I physically like tried to grab him up, and his wife is like, "Honey, it's okay. He has, PTSD flashbacks all the time." But it really got to me like how what I was seeing unfold in Manhattan so far away. And you feel so like, you feel so detached from it, like this can't be reality. But for this older gentleman who served in war before, it immediately took him back to combat in the thick of him being like seeing the aftermath of what acts of war on our soil would end up being. And we have seen, I've interviewed over the years multiple people who were inspired to enlist because of what happened on 9/11. Someone who grew up as a little boy with the World Trade Center towers outside of his window in New York. And then when this happened, it was like, that is my not just American soil home, but that's my home. And how dare they? I'm going to do whatever it takes. So people who had never thought of military service before, all of a sudden it moved to show their patriotism and enlist to serve in our military. But I do think that's the one moment in history where, as a journalist, it hit me like this is one of those historic moments that will rank so high on the list of my short timeline in life for my kids, for my grandkids. I actually like when my station sent me to Manhattan to cover it. Weeks later, we were flying into New York, and you could see from the plane a smoldering embers from ground zero. And this was weeks later. And that really shocked me too, because you think the building's collapsed, the fire is out, and it was hard to fathom that the embers and all of that buried concrete and human remains were still smoldering weeks later. It was really difficult to fathom. When my photographer and I went down there, it was really shocking too to see blocks away from the heart of ground zero, there were high rises with blown out windows just from the sheer force of the impact. And when I got down to ground zero, the other thing that really struck me as odd and will be forever seared in my psyche is like seeing people who were down there taking photographs and, just looking in shock, like, what happened down here? But then there was also um, a very awkward thing. I think people recognized the historic significance and wanted to document it. So you had people taking pictures because you had these chain linked fences where there were color printouts of people's missing loved ones. Have you seen this person? This is my brother. This is my son. This is my mother, my sister. And that was really personal, and that was really hard to take too. Um, but for people who went down there, I just remember the smell of, oh, it was, it was, I don't want to, I don't know how to say it without being like anything other than it was like burnt. They describe it as like burnt flesh. I don't know. It sounds crass to describe it that way, but it was the most pungent, horrid smell. And I've never smelt anything like that again. But it was just like, what is this? Um, senses, the smells, the visual things, the way people were crying and hugging and everything. You also had awkward tourists who we followed a group of tourists who went down there just to monetarily support some of the businesses, knowing that a lot of businesses are going to be shut down and all this stuff. So they're like, let's go down there. One, we'll volunteer our time in soup kitchens if we need to. We'll spend money, do everything that we can to support the people in Manhattan imminently of what happened there. So you had tourists down there too who didn't know how to handle this heavy, bizarre situation. So some of them were awkwardly like taking a selfie in front of it or asking people to take pictures of group pictures, and they're smiling, and it just felt so, what am I looking at? It was the weirdest thing because people didn't know how to really react to just the raw emotion of what they were seeing.
And I hate interrupting you because this is interesting, but it's like I speak of this and I tell people this is a 23rd anniversary coming up, and it fights me to even say the word anniversary because you think of an anniversary, just celebrated 30 years with my wife. It's like you think of that as a celebration, and by no means can we celebrate what happened 23 years ago, but remember it. So it's like even the words you use seem so difficult to put into the air to let someone listen because you never want to forget the somberness of what this day is.
It's hollowed ground. And I also interviewed former Phoenix Fire Chief Bob Kahn. They have a very elite tactical team that goes down and does, they help with like Oklahoma City bombing, all these different um, building disasters. And so they took canines down there. They took an elite trained team down there to try to look for survivors. I had a girlfriend I went to high school with who was at a hospital, and she said they opened the ORs, the ERs, standing by for injured, and no one came because so many of them died. And it's just, it gives me chills now to think about that. And he shared photographs and videos with me. Um, for the first time from his team, they traveled with Phoenix Fire, sent a photojournalist down there as well. And you see them removing buckets at a time, like 5-gallon buckets at a time of concrete debris, cutting away, rebar and all this jumbled up, jangled up building debris, listening, hoping, praying that you're going to hear someone who needs help, who is trapped in an air pocket. And there was just, I just think I've talked to also victims' families who have said, like, just those days, the initial few days where it's like, statistically, how long can someone live without water, without food, with limited air supply, all those things. And as those hours diminish and the days diminish, the hope just was rushing. Um, for them all, like rushing there, thinking, we're going to make a difference, we're going to save lives, but all they're carting away. Uh, it was even hard, he said, you weren't even finding body parts. Everyone was reduced to ash on the scene. So when you let that sink in, you're talking thousands of floors, all coming, hundreds of floors coming down with the weight and velocity that it's reduced humans to ash. And there's nothing for those families to bury on our soil. And I think the other thing too that changed for so many people who saw it firsthand is the fear then of, are we going to have to worry about attacks on sporting events, on malls, on other things where we know that uh, all of these symbols of American, our economy, our success as a nation were targeted on 9/11. You think of like what other elements that have great populated concentration are those going to come under attack? And that was a really scary thing too in the days and months and years that followed.
Yeah, no, it's crazy because I mean, here in Phoenix, we had the Diamondbacks playing in the World Series at that same time, and you put 45,000, 50,000 people in Bank One ballpark at the time, or 50,000 people in the old Yankee Stadium. The fear that was in every ticket holder's heart as they walked through that gate was was crazy. I was lucky enough to be at all 7 games, and
Hmm.
I was in a game I walked in I didn't say to my wife beforehand, I love you, because she wasn't with me, and I knew there was a chance that I wouldn't see her. So it, like you said, I think this is because you have to go all the way back to World War II, that there was an attack of such stature in America that wasn't in the continents. I mean, or I should say, the contiguous states.
Mhm.
So I think this is one of those things where, for the first time, we all realized we're vulnerable, and I appreciate your insight to this. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your trip once you got there, and some of the resiliency that you saw in New Yorkers and in the people that visited, that maybe gave you a tinge of hope that said, we're going to do well, we're going to be okay.
One of the other stories that I really remember, that I think if people like your students today, if they were to watch the documentary that the Nade brothers put together, because they happened to be following along some of those firefighters on that day. So they incidentally had a film crew out there, saw the plane hit, saw the buildings come down. Um, is I'll never forget a first responder from the Red Cross, because a lot of them went there to help counsel some of the other first responders who were there. So I profiled one of the first responders who was volunteering from Spokane and who was dispatched there, and he said, just there was a firefighter who talked about the sound of, like, it sounded like a crazy crashing loud and also physically reverberating, you know, vibration shook the ground and everything, and everybody's scrambling around wondering what's going on, or is that another attack? What's going on? It was people jumping from the high rise, and this firefighter was talking to this Red Cross volunteer, just sharing his raw emotion. As he was running into the building, he hears that loud crashing sound and looks back, and someone had jumped from the high rise and landed on his partner, killing him. That is something you don't get over. I don't know how you get over that, for one, but in the moment also continue to still rush into that burning building where people know that it's better to jump than stay up there with the jet fuel that's coming through the high rise and everything like that. It was just, we can't underscore enough the heroism of those first responders and what they were dealing with in the moment. Um, but I think what helped, and seeing it firsthand, the people who went there to support in the soup kitchens and spend their money and kind of say, "Hey, New York, we love you. America, we love you." It was really beautiful because they came from, I was following a group of people and volunteers from Spokane, Washington, tiny old Spokane, Washington, whatever, but you had groups of people doing the same thing, move to make a difference in some way or another. How can we uh, have a show of support for all these New Yorkers? You mentioned the World Series. I also interviewed Luis Gonzalez. Of course, they suspended the World Series games, and then he talked about how, like, baseball became this universal feel good opportunity because it felt so weird. Like, can we have something that can bring this nation together to celebrate? And he talked about, like, how it was such a bizarre feeling, like you're in the World Series, but in the heart of Manhattan, and giving these people an opportunity for a distraction of, like, it's okay. This is America's favorite pastime. We're gonna show people that we can come together and have something that we will in someday have a new normal of what that's going to feel like. So that's, I think, something that uh, struck a lot of people. One thing that I think is also very actionable for your students to do is the healing fields in Tempe. And I try to make a point as often as I can to go down there when they set up those flags. I think you said that your campus has flags down there. Do they put the names? Do they have a flag with a little placard that has a photograph and kind of the backstory of each of the victims on it?
Not the backstory. What we actually have is we have they're probably 8 foot posters,
Okay.
3,000, and they're side by side by side against the wall in the library. And each flag has somebody's name who passed away on 9/11, and it's
Mhm.
the wall of the library covered with that, and then some photos and some stories on easels in front of that. But it's a small way, I think, for our campus to do something that says we remember and
Right.
these lives mattered.
Yeah. That's really powerful too. Um, just take, you know, 5 minutes. I could spend hours down there. And it's very emotional because sometimes they'll have this volunteer bagpiper who goes out there and he's playing taps, but when you're looking at those people's photographs, their names, and seeing that this was a little boy who was on a flight and somebody put a teddy bear down there or something, it really hits home that these are actual people we lost, and it's not just numbers. It's American families who um, we still can't even fathom the loss of it.
And I look at this every year that we do this, and it's interesting because I know the banners I don't want to look at because I know there's names on it that I know.
Hmm.
I'll read 3 over here and I'll look at 1 over here, but I won't look at these 2 that have the names of people that I don't get to see. So
Yeah, yeah. But
it's
like you said, the more that we get further out from the actual day of, next year will be 24, then we'll come up on the 25th anniversary. We have more Americans, young Americans who um, don't know what that day was like, and how are they recognizing it in the history books and in their family history and things like that. It certainly did impact so many American families, not just by sheer loss of all those victims, but families who then enlisted, and that has another whole ripple effect. um, but yeah, I do think it was, like I said, the first time that history played out real time on live television. And I also heard interesting stories over the years. I interviewed air traffic controllers who were working on 9/11, and they talked about how bizarre it was. If you've ever searched up, you can pull up online like what air traffic control looks like on any given day, any time of day. It doesn't matter, 24/7. It looks like a web of green, and it's showing flights coming and going and landing and everything like that. But there is a timeline animation that shows when all that green just went to nothing and it was a standstill. And also how they were tasked with tracking down one flight traffic controller talked to me about like how he had to get on the radio and try to get this man who was down in the East Valley with a small prop plane, and he was going to do some, crop dusting and stuff. And they're trying to contact him, sir. You need to ground. It's a all stop. No one could be in the air right now. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just going over my field. He had no idea what was going on. And they said, we're scrambling a fighter jet to come intercept you. And it took, like, he could not believe what was happening there. But, in the moment, this is something that no one could have imagined was going to happen. So it was a world changer.
and and this is kind of, I mean, not that this all hasn't been personal, but you've been in Phoenix for quite some time now, and there are news stories and events that happen that change your life, your manner. But just from my knowledge of you and watching what you've done, I feel like this has hit more than anything else you've done. Can you kind of talk to how and why this was the story, or and maybe you already had a tie to the military and first responders and everything else, but it seems like it kind of grew from this. Am I right? Or
Well, I always had, grown up with a great respect for our military men and women who serve. My grandfathers on both sides. Many of my uncles served and enlisted voluntarily. Some of them were drafted, but many of them enlisted voluntarily and served. I even have a nephew now who's in service, um, and also in local law enforcement. So that's always been something that's near and dear to my heart. People who sign up to serve, knowing that their uh, career is more than a job. It's a passion. It's a profession that is serving others, and that's not something you could say for every job that's out there, right? Everyone has a purpose in this, story of life as we're unfolding in our community. But those who would dedicate their life to serve others, to potentially give their life to save others, and sight unseen for so many strangers, who not just sight unseen, but many strangers who, one, don't know, two, don't care, and three, don't respect the service that's given to them, but they do it anyway. Um, there's no more honorable service that I can think of.
Uh,
And 9/11 really drove that home, I think, to see the other image never get out of my head from that day is after the after the Twin Towers came down and the dust settled. I mean, it was like you had live cameras that went to a blackout because so much dust and debris filled the lens that it looked like daytime. It went to nighttime immediately. And then as the lens started coming back in focus again, you can see people just covered in ash walking around like zombies. And yet you had firefighters and police officers who were still running to try and help,
towards
running towards knowing that it was a worst case scenario there. And they were still determined to run to try to help those people.
okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing some of this. I know it's not easy to talk about, and I'm so grateful that you're a voice. And I guess the last question I would ask you before I let you off of this is, what would you suggest to people who think they might want to give up, not necessarily in the military, but to be supportive, to help those who help others? How can we as members of the community do more, do better?
That's a hard question.
You're a smart
We
woman.
always we always want to do more and do better, right? And that's, I guess, the spirit of Patriots Day, right? Is to, at least for a day, be intentional about going out of your way to do something for someone else, going out of your way to shake a hand of an officer, a firefighter, going out of your way to search up that documentary I mentioned about the Nade brothers and watch that and be set aside 2 hours of your life to watch some of that historic footage and be back in the moment to remember how we're such ants in the history of time, right? But to know that our positivity and our giving back and our difference can collectively make a great difference for so many others. And those families. I serve on the board for Military Assistance Mission. Our CEO is a Gold Star mom, and that means she lost her son serving. He was killed in Haditha, and like so many other Gold Star families, she could have simply like shrunk down, said F this world, whatever, and just kind of shut off. But she said, I'm going to be there for his brothers and sisters who are still in service. And so, for decades since losing him, and she found out on Mother's Day, if you can imagine that. But in the decades since losing him, she has made a commitment to serve all of his brothers and sisters who he never met and those families who, we I think take for granted as civilians many times too, the fact that even though you hear of like war in the Middle East or other things like that, there are so many other military servicemen and women who are deployed, some to our southern border, some to, you know, Italy, peace times, all those things, some to standing by, with all the conflict that's going on in the Middle East and stuff. So it doesn't have to be a combat zone for us to recognize the sacrifice those families are making. You've got dads and moms who are away from their little ones, 6 months, 8 months, 16 months at a time plus, and I think if there's anything that you can do to recognize those families in our own backyard and abroad, and I guess find a way to be thankful and take a pause and a beat. There are a lot of bad seeds in any profession, and in recent years there have been a lot of anti-police protests and things like that. Um, and I'm not saying that there haven't been cases that have warranted that. There certainly have. But if you take a beat as a human and say, wow, would I be signing up to serve a stranger who didn't appreciate me and they do it anyway? Doesn't matter if it's for local law enforcement or for our military. These people are there to try to make sure another 9/11 doesn't happen.
No. As each 9/11 rolls around, we keep having that same prayer. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks.